with that. I'm joined now by political commentator and associate professor at the University of Cape Town, Professor Richard Calland, who himself is in France at the moment. And Prof, good evening and thank you very much for your time. You've had to witness this all happen in real time. I read some of the were particularly headlines online saying a respected but unloved president re-elected, but you're hearing there some of his supporters saying relief and happy. I mean, what is the sentiment on the ground looking at those two pictures that are being painted?
Well, I think that's right, Tarbara. This was an important election because of the threat posed by Marine Le Pen, a far-right candidate, anti-immigration, anti-the-European Union, someone who would really have driven a stake through the heart of France's current multilateral international foreign affairs policy. And so it would have shifted global relations in a really substantial way at a time when the world needs greater cooperation between nations, whether it be on climate change or on security, given the war in Ukraine, or indeed on finding common cause across countries in relation to difficult and delicate issues like immigration. So I think you're right, the sense of relief in France is palpable. Macron, however, has a mountain to climb now to unify his divided nation. It's very clear that he won on the back of a large number of voters who voted for him only because they didn't want Le Pen. In fact, the statistic that came out today was that 91% of Jean-Luc Mélenchon's voters, he's a far-left candidate who got 20% in the first round of elections, came third, narrowly third to Le Pen. 91% of Mélenchon's voters voted for Macron only because they wanted to keep Marine Le Pen out, not because they really support Macron. So he's got to reach across the aisle, as the saying goes, particularly to those of the left, and try and form a government that will start to rebuild, as I say, a divided nation.
A decisive victory, but others saying certainly does not come without its warnings, especially if you consider how Marine Le Pen performed previously and where she is right now. I mean, she did manage to come really close. 41.8% is not something to be sneezed at. What does that tell us about, I suppose, what the sentiment is really shifting in France?
Well, that's right. And on the one hand, this is an extraordinary victory because in 2015, 2016, no one had really heard of Emmanuel Macron. He was not a well-known politician. He created this movement almost out of nothing and then stormed to a victory in 2017. He's won re-election, without really a big political party behind him. That's an extraordinary outcome and a great achievement. But on the other hand, he's dropped 8%. And Le Pen has obviously gone up 8%, and she now is the first far-right candidate to have won over 40% of the nation's support in a runoff election. That is a big increase. If you think her father, who was the sort of, the dragon in the den in terms of far-right politics at the turn of the century, and in 2002 secured 18%. Now you see, 20 years later, that big increase from 18% to over 41.8%. That's a significant rise. And so the trend, therefore, I think will encourage far-right voters, and it will worry progressive Democrats, and it will worry people who believe in the European Union. And I think the next question is, well, firstly, what will happen in just 6 weeks' time in the June legislative elections, the elections for the National Assembly? You've got to remember, viewers must remember that France has a very different electoral and system of government to South Africa. There are two elections, one for the president and then a few weeks later one for parliament. And that parliamentary election will be a really important election in terms of the balance of power at the heart of French government.
Yeah. Will he manage to curb the appeal of populism? Some saying this win is also a win against the populism I suppose, narrative in France?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because he's won, and that's a really important victory. No, because of the trends that I've been referring to, including the one you mentioned in your first question, your setup question, where you referred to the relatively low turnout, the worst turnout for 50 years. I was outside Paris in the southern part of France in the run-up to the election a couple of days ago, and in the town where I was paying attention to these things, there were signs in cafes inviting voters to come and discuss whether to even vote or not. Apparently it was a Mélenchon area, so these were left-of-centre voters who were asking themselves the question, is there any point? Do we still believe in representative democracy? And that chimes very much with global trends around turnout, but also about a sense that politics no longer matters, or representative politics no longer counts and no longer helps people. And that, of course, feeds this populist dragon. It feeds the sense that some other alternative must be found, and whether it's Trump or Brexit or some other extra parliamentary force, it does mean that for someone like Macron, he now has to rebuild, he has to regain trust, he has to prove to people across the political spectrum that he can govern for all. His electoral campaign slogan, very neat two-word slogan, the shortest I've ever seen, nous tous, us all. That has probably got to continue to be his guiding light for the next 5 years. And of course, France has a two-term rule like South Africa, so this is his second and last term. He doesn't have a political party to worry about. It's not like Ramaphosa and the ANC. Yeah. He can govern, in a sense, with a free hand. And I think you're already seeing signs that he's going to be quite a different president in the second term.
So there are, of course, these, as you mentioned, other micro parties that are aligned to him, some kind of a coalition. Does he stand a chance, or a fair chance at least, of winning another majority?
Well, I think that, as I say, in mid-June, the issue will be precisely that. What sort of outcome in the National Assembly of France will come from that parliamentary election? In 2017, Macron won the presidential election, of course, and then a few weeks later, his movement, his new movement for France, along with a similar sort of centralist movement. They won 350 of the 577 seats, secured a big majority. And he's been able to govern, in a sense, with Parliament behind him. Seems to me quite unlikely that that will happen this time. It's more likely that there'll be probably no majority for any one party in the new Parliament. And so he'll have to deal with quite a kind of splintered, fractured National Assembly with votes for right and far left. And of course, what's so interesting, Tabu, about this election is that it follows another international trend, which is that centre-right and centre-left parties are beginning to fail very, very badly. In the first round of the presidential election in France 2 weeks ago, just over 2 weeks ago, the Socialist Party, which provided the presidents of Mitterrand and Calland and others, got less than 2%, and the Republican Party, the right-of-centre party, got just 7%. So unthinkable that these two centre parties would get less than 10%. That means that voters have pushed out to the far right and indeed to the far left. Macron stands as an island in the middle.
Yeah. Is that going to be a problem for him, especially with those voters, as you say, who feel that representative democracy no longer works for them? They feel left out. They feel like it has done nothing for them. Now we know France and protests. I mean, we think we have service delivery protests here. Will he be meeting a challenge on the streets?
Well, he may well do. And of course, I think you're referring to the so-called yellow jacket protests of 3 or 4 years ago, which in the end he managed to handle. It was a tough moment for his presidency, and it even looked at one point as if his government might fall. It was a sort of revolutionary whiff in the air 3 or 4 years ago. But he dealt with it in the end. He's a very adept politician. He's probably done more for working people than his critics from the left and the right would suggest. What he's got to do is sell that in a different way. He's got to prove that he can govern for all. His challenge politically will be, when you've got your political spectrum stretched in the way it is, how do you form a sort of moderate centralist alliance to the right and the left when there is a vacuum on either side of you? It's going to be very difficult for him. He can't go far to the right. He's got really nothing in common with Le Pen. He made that clear during the campaign. Maybe the approach he has to take is to reach out to Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left candidate, and form a kind of liberal left, centre left coalition of some kind over the next 5 years. Otherwise, I think the spectre, the shadow of a far-right racist leader winning power at the Elysee in 5 years' time will continue to haunt France and Europe.
Professor Richard Calland, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on this evening. That's political commentator and associate professor at the University of Cape Town, Professor Richard Calland.